The relentless Arizona sun beat down on Miles, Blackwood's weathered face as he guided his horse through the unforgiving terrain of Rattlesnake Canyon. 6 years since he'd last ridden with anyone beside him. 6 years of nothing but the company of his own shadow and the occasional howl of distant coyotes. At 42, the lines around his eyes told stories of hardship and loss that his lips refused to share. "Come on, Scout," he muttered to his faithful Palomino, patting the horse's neck. "Water should be just beyond that ridge." Miles adjusted his worn leather hat, pulling it lower to shield his eyes from the merciless sun. The faded star pinned. To his vest a remnant of his former life as a Texas Ranger caught the light occasionally, a reminder of everything he'd left behind. After what happened in Laramie, he'd turned his back on civilization, choosing instead the honest company of his horse and the vast emptiness of the frontier. The day had started like any other, hunting for a suitable place to make camp before continuing his journey to nowhere in particular. But fate had other plans for the solitary rider. Scout suddenly halted, ears perked forward, nostrils flaring. "What is it, boy?" Miles tensed, hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. Years of survival on these trails had taught him to trust his horse's instincts more than his own. The horse whinnied nervously, refusing to move forward. Miles dismounted, boots landing softly on the dusty ground. He drew his gun and advanced cautiously, each step measured and silent. The canyon walls loomed on either side, creating perfect hiding spots for ambushes, something he'd learned the hard way. That's when he saw a dark shape crumpled against a rock formation ahead, partially hidden by scrub brush. At first, he thought it might be an animal, perhaps wounded by predators. But as he drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. A woman. Her dress, once a deep blue, was now stained dark with dried blood. Her face, though bruised and caked with dirt, held an unexpected beauty. Dark hair spilled across the rocks, and Miles could see the shallow rise and fall of her chest. She was alive, but barely. "Ma'am?" he called softly, holstering his weapon and approaching slowly. No response. Miles knelt beside her, noting the severity of her condition. Multiple knife wounds marked her torso, and bruises encircled her neck. Whoever had done this had left her for dead, and not long ago, judging by the state of her wounds. Who would do such a thing? He muttered to himself, carefully checking for signs of broken bones before attempting to move her. A swift survey of the surroundings revealed the brutal story. Multiple boot prints, signs of a struggle, and abandoned rope suggested she'd been brought here by force, attacked, and left to die in this desolate place where no one would find her body. Miles had seen death before, had caused it too, when necessary, but the cruelty displayed here stirred something in him he thought had died years ago. Anger. He returned to Scout, retrieving his canteen. Gently, he lifted the woman's head, allowing a few drops of water to pass between her parched lips. Her eyelids fluttered briefly, revealing eyes the color of whiskey before closing again. "You're safe now," Miles said, though he doubted she could. "Hear him. I'm going to help you." With careful movements, he fashioned a makeshift travois from branches and his bedroll. Getting her to safety wouldn't be easy, but Miles knew of an abandoned trapper's cabin a few miles north. It wasn't much, but it would provide shelter while he tended to her wounds as he secured her to the travois. He noticed something clutched tightly in her hand. Gently prying open her fingers, he found a small locket silver with intricate engravings. Inside was a tiny photograph of a young girl. Miles replaced it in her palm, closing her fingers around it. "You've got someone waiting for you," he said, softly. "Let's get you patched up." The journey to the cabin was slow and arduous. Each jolt of the travois caused the woman to moan in pain, though she never fully regained consciousness. Miles found himself speaking to her words of encouragement, promises of safety breaking years of self-imposed silence. By nightfall, they reached the cabin. It was exactly as Miles remembered it, a small, sturdy structure built against the side of a hill, abandoned for years, but still standing defiant against the elements. He gently carried the woman inside, laying her on the single cot that remained. Working by lantern light, Miles cleaned and dressed her wounds using supplies from his saddlebags. His hands, calloused from years of hard living, moved with surprising gentleness as he tended to each cut and gash. Some were deep enough to require stitching, which he performed with the steady hand of a man who had patched himself up numerous times in the wilderness. When he finished, he built a fire in the stone hearth, bringing warmth to a place that had known none for years. He brewed coffee and prepared a simple broth, hoping the woman might wake enough to take some nourishment. As the night deepened, Miles sat vigil by her side. Her fever had risen, and he regularly replaced the cool cloth on her forehead. In her delirium, she sometimes spoke fragmented words and pleas that painted a disturbing picture. Double quotes, please, the ledger. They'll kill her. I never. Elizabeth. Run. Miles wondered who this woman was and what trouble had found her. One thing was certain: whoever had tried to kill her might come looking to finish the job. His hand unconsciously moved to his revolver. It had been years since he'd gotten involved in another person's fight, but something about this woman stirred protective instincts he thought had died with his wife and daughter. Dawn broke with a gentle light filtering through the cabin's single window. Miles had dozed off in the chair beside the cot, his hand still resting on his gun. A soft sound woke him instantly. The woman was stirring. Her eyes opened, those whiskey-colored eyes now alert and filled with fear as they darted around the unfamiliar surroundings before landing on Miles. She tried to move, then winced in pain. "Easy," Miles said, keeping his distance to avoid frightening her further. "You're safe. I found you in Rattlesnake Canyon. You were badly hurt." The woman's eyes widened, her hand instinctively moving to her throat, then to the locket still clutched. In her other hand, relief washed over her face when she found it there. Double quotes, who. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Who are you?" "Name's Miles Blackwood. I was passing through when I found you." She swallowed with difficulty. "Water. Please." Miles brought the canteen to her lips, supporting her head as she drank. When she finished, she sank back onto the pillow, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "Thank you," she whispered. They. They would have come back for me." "Who would?" A shadow crossed her face. "Caldwell's men. They work for—" A fit of coughing interrupted her words. "Rest now," Miles said. "Plenty of time for talking when you're stronger." She shook her head weakly. "No time. They'll be looking for me and the ledger." "What ledger?" Her eyes met his, desperate and pleading. "I was a bookkeeper for Randall Caldwell in Copper Springs. He owns the mines, the bank, everything. I found proof he's been stealing from the miners, poisoning those who complain. When he discovered, I knew." Her voice trailed off. Miles nodded slowly, the picture becoming clearer. "And now his men think you have evidence that could ruin him." "I do," she whispered. "Hidden. But that's not why. Her hand tightened around the locket. "My sister. They have my sister Elizabeth." Understanding dawned on Miles. This wasn't just about running from danger. This woman was trying to save someone she loved. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Catherine." "Catherine Walsh." "Well, Miss Walsh, you need to heal before you can help anyone. I'll keep watch. Try to sleep." Catherine's eyes held his for a long moment before closing. "Why are you helping me?" she murmured, already drifting off. Miles didn't answer. He wasn't sure he knew himself. Instead, he checked his ammunition and positioned himself by the window, scanning the horizon. If Caldwell's men were searching, they'd eventually find this cabin. And when they did, Miles would be waiting. As Catherine slept, Miles considered his options. He'd spent years avoiding other people's problems, determined never again to put himself in a position where he could fail someone who depended on him. Yet here he was, preparing to defend a woman he barely knew against men who would surely kill them both if given the chance. The memories he'd tried so hard to bury resurfaced: his wife and daughter, the raid on their homestead while he was away, his badge that had meant nothing when it mattered most. He'd sworn never to wear the star again, never to believe he could protect anyone. But as he watched Catherine's chest rise and fall with each labored breath, Miles knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. If you're enjoying this tale of courage and redemption in the Wild West, make sure to like and share this video with fellow Western enthusiasts. Chapter 2. 3 days passed in a rhythm of changing bandages, brewing broth, and standing watch. Catherine's strength returned gradually, her body fighting the infection that had threatened to take her. Miles found himself drawn into conversation with her during her waking hours, something he hadn't experienced in years. "You were a ranger?" Catherine asked, sitting up in the cot, her back supported by rolled blankets. Miles nodded, his eyes fixed on the coffee pot heating over the fire. "Long time ago? What happened?" Her question was gentle, but Miles felt it like a physical blow. "Some stories ain't worth telling," he replied, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. Catherine studied him, then nodded. "We all have those." A silence fell between them, but unlike the solitude Miles had known for years, this silence felt strangely companionable. "I need to get to Silverdale," Catherine said finally. "My sister works as a maid in Caldwell's house there. When I didn't return with the ledger, I'm afraid of what he might do to her. Silverdale's 4 days' ride from here, and you can barely stand. I don't have a choice." Catherine's voice was firm despite her weakness. "Elizabeth is only 17. Our parents died last year. She's all I have left." Miles poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handing one to Catherine. "Caldwell doesn't strike me as a man who acts rashly. He'll keep your sister safe as leverage, at least until he gets what he wants." "The ledger," Catherine confirmed. "It shows everything: the money he's stolen, the names of miners who died in accidents after they threatened to expose him. It's enough to hang him." "Where is it?" Catherine hesitated, her eyes searching his face. Trust didn't come easily to either of them. "Hidden in my boarding house room in Copper Springs, under a loose floorboard. But I can't go back there. They'll be watching." Miles considered their options. "We'll need supplies before heading to Silverdale. There's a trading post about half a day's ride from here. I'll go tomorrow, see what I can learn about Caldwell's movements." "I should come with you," Catherine insisted. "You'll stay here and rest," Miles countered, his tone brooking no argument. "One more day won't make a difference to your sister, but riding too soon might reopen your wounds." Catherine reluctantly agreed, though her eyes revealed her frustration. Miles understood waiting was its own kind of torture when someone you loved was in danger. The next morning, Miles prepared to leave for the trading post. He left Catherine with his spare revolver, showing her how to use it. 6 shots, he explained. "Make them count if anyone comes around who isn't me." Catherine's hand closed around the gun with surprising confidence. "I'm a quick learner, Mr. Blackwood." A smile briefly touched Miles' weathered face. "I don't doubt it, Miss Walsh." The trading post was a ramshackle building situated at a crossroads, frequented by trappers and the occasional prospector. As Miles approached, he noted 3 horses hitched outside more company than he'd expected. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke, and the smell of unwashed bodies. Two men stood at the counter, deep in conversation with the proprietor. A third sat at a small table, nursing a glass of whiskey. All three wore dusty trail clothes and gun belts that had seen frequent use. Miles kept his head down as he gathered supplies coffee, beans, ammunition, and bandages. He lingered near shelves of canned goods, ears attuned to the conversation at the counter. Woman might have headed north, one man was saying. Caldwell wants her found yesterday. What did she do? Asked the proprietor, a grizzled man with one cloudy eye. Stole from the boss, replied the second man. Pretty little thing with dark hair. Might be injured. Ain't seen nobody like that, the proprietor said. But I'll keep an eye out. Reward? $50, said the first man. Dead or alive, though Caldwell prefers alive. Miles kept his expression neutral as he brought his supplies to the counter. The men gave him a cursory glance before continuing their conversation outside. The third man remained at his table, eyes following Miles with quiet interest. As Miles paid for his goods, the proprietor studied him. Don't get many strangers these days. Where are you headed? Nowhere in particular, Miles replied. Just passing through. The man at the table stood, approaching the counter. Heading north? He asked casually. Miles sized him up, lean, capable looking, with eyes that missed nothing. South, he lied. Looking for work, the man nodded slowly. Name's Harper. Those fellows work for Randall Caldwell, big mine owner in these parts. Always looking for hired guns. I'm done with that kind of work, Miles said, gathering his supplies. Harper's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Noticed you still? Wear iron. Old habits. As Miles turned to leave, Harper spoke again, his voice lower. Whoever you're helping, friend Caldwell's not a man who forgets a slight. He's got men all over this territory. Miles paused, meeting the man's gaze. Appreciate the warning. Outside, Miles secured his supplies to Scout's saddle, mindful of the three men now mounting their horses nearby. They gave him a final glance before riding east, away from the direction of the cabin. Miles waited until they were out of sight before heading back, taking a circuitous route to ensure he wasn't followed. Catherine was standing when he returned, the revolver steady in her hand as he entered. Relief washed over her face when she recognized him. They're looking for you, Miles said without preamble, unloading the supplies. 3 of Caldwell's men were at the trading post. Catherine's face paled. Did they recognize you? No, but they're spreading word. $50 reward. Catherine sank onto the cot. We need to move. They'll find this place eventually. Miles nodded. We leave at first light. Think you can ride? I'll manage. Her determination was evident in the set of her jaw. That night, as they ate a simple meal of beans and coffee, Catherine's gaze kept drifting to the faded star pinned to Miles' vest. Why do you still wear it? She finally asked. The Ranger badge. Miles' hand moved unconsciously to touch the star. Reminder, he said simply. Of what? He met her eyes across the fire. Of failure. Of what happens when you're not there, when people need you. Catherine didn't press further, but later, as Miles took first watch by the window, she spoke from the darkness of the cot. My father used to say that the bravest thing a person can do is try again after failing, she said softly. I think finding me in that canyon was your way of trying again, Mr. Blackwood. Miles didn't respond, but her words settled somewhere deep inside him, disturbing dust that had gathered over old wounds. Dawn brought fog rolling through the canyon, providing welcome cover as they prepared to leave. Catherine moved stiffly, but insisted on helping to pack. Miles noticed her wince as she lifted her saddlebags. Your wounds bothering you? She shook her head. I'll be fine. Miles knew she was lying, but admired her grit. He'd seen hardened men complain more about lesser injuries. They rode north, keeping to less traveled paths. Catherine sat straight in her saddle, despite the pain Miles knew she must be feeling. Occasionally, she would press her hand to her side, where the deepest knife wound was still healing, but she never asked to stop. "Tell me about your sister," Miles said as they picked their way through a rocky pass. Catherine's face softened. "Elizabeth is bright, too bright for a place like Copper Springs. She sees the good in everyone, even when there isn't any to see." She touched the locket around her neck. "Our mother died when Elizabeth was born, and our father raised us alone. When he passed last year, I promised him I'd take care of her. That's why you took the bookkeeping job with Caldwell." Catherine nodded. "It paid better than teaching, which is what I did before." Elizabeth got work as a maid in his house in Silverdale. Her expression darkened. "I didn't realize what kind of man he was until it was too late." "How did you find the ledger?" "By accident. I was working late, and Caldwell had been drinking. He asked me to file some papers in his office, gave me the combination without thinking. The ledger was there, along with letters from men he paid to cause accidents at the mine." Miles considered this. "And he knew you'd seen it?" "Not. At first, I was careful. But then one of the miners who'd been speaking out against working conditions died suddenly. The official story was that he fell down a mine shaft, but I'd seen his name in the ledger. I confronted Caldwell." She shook her head. "I thought I could scare him into confessing, making things right. Instead, he sent men to silence." "You," Miles finished. "Yes. I managed to escape Copper Springs with the ledger, but they caught up to me near Rattlesnake Canyon." Her hand unconsciously moved to the knife wounds on her torso. "They took their time. Wanted to know where I'd hidden the ledger. When I wouldn't tell them, they decided to leave me to die slowly." Anger flashed through Miles at the thought of what she'd endured. "These men, would you recognize them again?" Catherine's eyes hardened. "Every face, every voice. I'll never forget." They rode in silence for a while, each lost in thought. The terrain grew more challenging as they climbed higher into the foothills, and Miles kept a watchful eye on Catherine. Concerned her strength might fail. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had gathered, promising a storm. Miles led them to a sheltered overhang, just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. "We'll rest here until it passes," he decided, helping Catherine dismount. She didn't protest, which told Miles more than words could about her condition. Once, under the rocky shelter, he checked her bandages and found blood seeping through one on her side. "You've reopened the wound," he said, concern evident in his voice. "It doesn't matter," Catherine insisted. "We need to keep moving." "Not in this," Miles gestured to the torrential rain now falling, "and not with you bleeding. Let me redress it." Catherine reluctantly allowed him to tend to her wound. His hands were gentle as he cleaned and rebandaged it, and she found herself studying his face, the lines of hardship, the eyes that had seen too much, the mouth that rarely smiled. "Why are you really helping me, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked quietly. "You could have left me at the trading post or taken me to a doctor and continued on your way." Miles was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "I had a daughter," he finally said, his voice rough. "She'd be about your age now. And a wife, Emily and Sarah." The names sounded rusty, as though they hadn't been spoken aloud in years. "I was away on ranger business when Comancheros raided our homestead. By the time I got back," Catherine's hand found his, squeezing gently. "I'm sorry." Miles nodded once, sharply. 6 years ago, I tracked the men who did it, every last one. And when it was done, I couldn't wear the badge anymore. Couldn't face people, their problems. So I've been riding, just riding, "Until you found me," Catherine said softly. "Until I found you," he agreed. The storm raged outside their shelter, but within it, something had shifted between them, a sharing of burdens, a recognition of kindred spirits who had both known loss and kept moving forward despite it dark as night. Fell and the rain continued. They made a small, smokeless fire. Miles insisted Catherine take what rest she could while he kept watch. She was asleep almost instantly, exhaustion overcoming her determination. Miles studied her face in the firelight, the strength in her features even in repose, the slight furrow between her brows that spoke of worries that followed her into dreams. He felt a protectiveness that went beyond duty or obligation. The storm had nearly passed when Miles heard the distant sound of horses approaching. He doused the fire immediately and moved to the edge of the overhang, peering into the darkness. Lightning flashed, illuminating 5 riders moving slowly along the trail below their position. Miles recognized 2 of them from the trading post. They were following their trail, despite his precautions. He moved quickly back to Catherine, placing his hand gently over her mouth as he woke her. She started, eyes wide, but relaxed when she saw him. He put a finger to his lips and pointed downward. She nodded her understanding. They remained motionless as the riders passed beneath them, voices carrying in the wet night air. Trails washing out in this rain. Keep looking. Caldwell will have our hides if we come back empty-handed again. Could be miles from here by now. She was hurt bad, Vince said. Can't have gone far, especially in this weather. The voices faded as the riders moved on, but Miles knew they'd be back. Caldwell's men were casting a wide net, and eventually they'd find the cabin and pick up the trail again. We need to change our plan, Miles whispered. They're between us and Silverdale now. Catherine's face was grim in the darkness. We need to get the ledger first anyway. It's the only leverage we have to ensure Elizabeth's safety. That means going back to Copper Springs. She nodded. If we can get the ledger, we can force Caldwell to release my sister. Miles considered their options. It's risky. Copper Springs will be the first place they'll look for you. Which is why I need to go alone, Catherine said firmly. You can continue to Silverdale, find Elizabeth. No? Miles' response was immediate. We stay together. The intensity in his voice surprised them both. After a moment, Catherine nodded. Together. Then. But how do we get to Copper Springs without being seen? Miles thought for a moment. We don't use the roads. Cross country, through Mason's Pass. It's rough terrain, but Caldwell's men won't be watching it. Mason's Pass is treacherous this time of year, Catherine warned. So are Caldwell's men, Miles replied grimly. We leave at first light, before they circle back this way. Don't forget to comment below with your favorite part of the story so far. Your engagement helps this channel grow and brings more Western Tales to life. Chapter 3 Mason's Pass lived up to its reputation. The narrow trail wound through jagged rocks and steep inclines, forcing them to dismount and lead their horses through the most treacherous sections. Catherine moved with determined precision, despite her injuries, and Miles found himself admiring her resilience, or with each passing hour by nightfall of the second day. They had cleared the worst of the pass and made camp in a small grove of pines that offered some protection from prying eyes. Miles built a fire, keeping it small and well shielded. We should reach Copper Springs by tomorrow afternoon, he said, passing Catherine a cup of coffee. We'll need a plan for getting to your boarding house unnoticed. Catherine sipped the hot liquid, grateful for its warmth. Mrs. Holloway's boarding house is on the edge of town. There's a back entrance through the garden that few know about. And the ledger? You're certain it's still there? She nodded. The floorboard is loose under the bed. Unless they tore the room apart, board by board, they wouldn't have found it. Miles studied the map he'd drawn in the dirt with a stick. Once we have the ledger, we head straight for Silverdale. No stops. Catherine's eyes reflected the firelight as she looked at him. And when we get there, Caldwell will have guards. It won't be easy to reach Elizabeth. One problem at a time, Miles replied. First, the ledger. They fell into companionable silence, the kind that comes from shared danger and purpose. Catherine watched Miles as he cleaned his revolver, his movements practiced and precise. "You never told me your plan after all this," she said finally. "Where will you go when it's over?" Miles' hands stilled momentarily before continuing there. "Work. Hadn't thought that far ahead." "You could stop running," Catherine suggested gently. "Find a place to settle." The ghost of a smile touched Miles' lips. "Been running so long, not sure I remember how to stop." Catherine reached across the space between them, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Perhaps it's time to find out." Their eyes met over the fire, something unspoken passing between them, possibility. Perhaps hope. Miles covered her hand with his own, rough calluses against smooth skin. The moment was broken by the distant howl of a wolf. Both tensed, hands moving instinctively to their weapons before recognizing the sound for what it was. "Get some rest," Miles said, returning to his task. "Tomorrow will be long." Catherine settled into her bedroll, watching Miles through half-closed eyes. "Wake me for second watch." He nodded, though they both knew he would let her sleep through the night. Copper Springs appeared on the horizon the following afternoon, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley. Smoke rose from the smelter at the edge of town, and the distant clang of mining equipment echoed across the landscape. Miles and Catherine observed from a ridge, staying well hidden among the trees. "Main Street looks busy," Miles noted. "Market day?" Catherine nodded. "Every third Wednesday. It works in our favor more strangers in town. Easier to blend in." They circled around to approach from the east, where a small creek provided cover, almost to the edge of town. As they drew closer, Miles could make out two men standing watch at the main road into town. "Caldwell's men," Catherine confirmed, her voice tight. "They're watching for me. Then we don't use the road." Miles pointed to a line of cottonwoods that ran behind several buildings. "We'll tie the horses there and approach the boarding house." On foot, they left their mounts concealed among the trees and made their way cautiously toward town, keeping to shadows and back alleys. Catherine led them to a modest two-story building with a small garden in the rear. A wooden fence surrounded the property, offering some privacy. "Mrs. Holloway will be serving dinner now," Catherine whispered. "Everyone will be in the dining room at the front of the house." They slipped through the garden gate and approached the back door. It was unlocked, just as Catherine had predicted. Inside, they could hear the distant murmur of conversation, and the clink of cutlery from the dining room. Catherine led Miles up a narrow back staircase, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her healing wounds. On the second floor, they moved silently down the hallway to the last door on the left. "It's locked," Catherine whispered after trying the handle. Miles produced a thin piece of metal from his pocket. "Stand watch," he instructed, kneeling to work on the lock. Within moments, there was a soft click, and the door swung open. The room was small but neat, with simple furnishings, a bed, a dresser, a small writing desk. It appeared undisturbed, which surprised them both. They didn't search it? Miles wondered. Aloud, Catherine moved quickly to the bed, kneeling to pry up a floorboard underneath. "Maybe they did, but not thoroughly enough," she suggested. Reaching into the revealed cavity, her face fell as her hand explored the empty space. "It's gone," she whispered, panic edging into her voice. "The ledger is gone." Miles joined her, examining the hiding place. Someone knew where to look. Catherine sat back on her heels, mind racing. "Mrs. Holloway, She's the only one who knew about the loose floorboard. I told her when I first moved in, worried I might fall through it. The sound of boots on the stairs froze them both. Miles drew his revolver, positioning himself beside the door as Catherine quickly replaced the floorboard. Voices became audible, two men speaking in low tones. Caldwell wants the room checked again. We've been through it 3 times already. Well, now it's 4. He's getting impatient. Miles caught Catherine's eye, motioning toward the window. She nodded, moving silently across the room to unlatch it. Window opened onto a narrow ledge with a drain pipe nearby, a risky escape route, but their only option. Catherine climbed out first, her movements careful and deliberate as she edged along the ledge toward the pipe. Miles followed, pulling the window closed behind him just as the door to the room opened. They descended the drain pipe as quietly as possible, the metal groaning slightly under their weight. Once on the ground, they darted across the garden to the gate, slipping out just as shouts erupted from the open window above. "They've spotted us," Miles warned, grabbing Catherine's hand. "Run!" They raced through back alleys toward the cottonwoods where they'd left their horses. Behind them, more shouts indicated that Caldwell's men were in pursuit. As they reached the trees, a shot rang out, splintering bark near Miles' head. They mounted. Quickly, Miles returning fire to provide cover as they galloped away from town. More shots followed, but none found their mark as they disappeared into the dense forest beyond the creek. Only when they were several miles from Copper Springs did Miles signal to slow their pace. Catherine was pale, her breathing labored from the exertion and pain of her wounds. "We need to rethink our approach," Miles said, guiding his horse alongside hers. "Without the ledger, I know where it is," Catherine interrupted, her voice steadier than her appearance suggested. "Mrs. Holloway must have given it to Caldwell. He'll have taken it to Silverdale. It's where he keeps everything of value in his house." Miles considered this. That complicates things. Breaking into Caldwell's home won't be easy. "I don't intend to break in," Catherine said, determination hardening her features. "I'm going to walk through the front door. That's suicide." "Not if he thinks I'm there to make a deal. The ledger for my sister." Miles shook his head emphatically. "Too dangerous. He'll have you both killed the moment he gets his hands on you." "Do you have a better suggestion?" Catherine challenged. "Elizabeth is there, Miles. I can't abandon her." The use of his first name didn't escape him. "I'm not suggesting we abandon her, but we need all eyes, information." Catherine considered this. "There's a man in Silverdale, Judge Wilson. He's honest, one of the few Caldwell hasn't bought. If we could get word to him, show him the ledger." "First we need to find the ledger," Miles reminded her, "and determine if your sister is still at Caldwell's house." They rode in thoughtful silence for several miles, the urgency of their situation weighing heavily on both. The sun was beginning to set when Catherine spoke again. "There's an old hunting cabin my father used to use, about 10 miles north of here. We could rest there tonight, plan our next move." Miles nodded. "Lead the way." The cabin was little more than a one-room shack, but it offered shelter, and more importantly, was unlikely to be known to Caldwell or his men. They settled in for the night, Miles building a small fire in the stone fireplace, while Catherine tended to the horses. When she returned, Miles noticed she was moving more stiffly than before. "Let me check your wounds," he insisted. Catherine didn't argue, sitting on a rough-hewn bench as Miles carefully examined the bandages. The largest wound had reopened slightly during their escape from Copper Springs. "It needs cleaning and fresh dressing," he said, reaching for his saddlebag. As he worked, Catherine watched his face, the intense concentration, the gentle touch that belied his rugged exterior. "You would have made a good doctor," she observed. Miles smiled faintly. Just had practice patching myself up over the years. When he finished, their faces were close, his hands still resting lightly on her waist. For a moment, neither moved. Caught in the intimacy of the moment, Catherine's hand came up to touch his cheek, fingers brushing against the stubble there. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for this, but for everything. For finding me in that canyon, for not looking away." Miles covered her hand with his own, turning his face slightly to press a kiss to her palm. The gesture, simple yet profound, spoke volumes between them. The moment was interrupted by a sound outside, a horse approaching. Miles was on his feet instantly, gun drawn as he moved to the window. "Single rider," he reported, peering through the darkness. "Coming slow." Catherine joined him, staying low beneath the windowsill. "Can you see who it is?" Miles shook his head. "Too dark." They watched as the rider drew closer, finally coming into view in the faint moonlight. Catherine gasped. "It's Harper," Miles said, recognizing the lean figure from the trading post. "How did he find us?" Catherine whispered. "That's what I intend to find out." Miles moved to the door, positioning himself to one side. "Stay back." Harper stopped a respectable distance from the cabin, raising his hands to show they were empty. "Blackwood?" he called. "I know you're in there." "I need to talk." Miles exchanged a glance with Catherine before responding. "Dismount slowly. Leave your weapons with your horse." Harper complied, removing his gun belt and laying it across his. Saddle before approaching the cabin with deliberate steps. "That's far enough," Miles called when Harper was about 10 feet from the door. "What do you want?" "Information," Harper replied, "and to deliver some as well." Miles emerged from the cabin, his revolver trained on Harper. "Start talking." Harper's eyes flicked briefly to Catherine, who had appeared in the doorway behind Miles. "Miss Walsh," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Glad to see you're recovering." "How do you know my name?" Catherine demanded. "Because I've been looking for you," Harper admitted. "But not for Caldwell. My name isn't really Harper. I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal James Harper. I've been investigating Caldwell for months." Miles didn't lower his gun. "Prove it." Harper slowly reached into his vest pocket, producing a badge. "I couldn't identify myself at the trading post too many years. But I've been tracking Caldwell's operation across 3 territories. Miss Walsh's evidence could be the key to bringing him down." Catherine stepped forward. "The ledger was taken from my hiding place." Harper nodded. "I know. Caldwell has it now, in his house in Silverdale, along with your sister. Is she safe?" Catherine asked urgently. "For now. Caldwell thinks she knows where you are. He's keeping her close." Miles finally lowered his weapon, though his expression remained wary. "Why come to us now?" "Because Caldwell is moving up his timetable. He's liquidating assets, preparing to leave the territory. When he does, he'll tie up loose ends, including your sister." Harper looked directly at Catherine. "We have maybe 2 days before he's gone." "What's your plan?" Miles asked. "I have men positioned in Silverdale, waiting for my signal. But we need that ledger to make charges stick. Without it, Caldwell walks free." Catherine and Miles exchanged looks. "We were planning to go to Silverdale anyway," she said. Harper nodded. "Good, but not alone. With my help, we stand a better chance of getting both your sister and the ledger." After Harper had shared everything he knew about Caldwell's operation and the layout of his Silverdale mansion, they formulated a plan. Catherine would approach Caldwell directly, offering to exchange her silence for her sister's freedom. Meanwhile, Miles and Harper would position themselves to intervene if things went wrong. "It's still dangerous," Miles told Catherine as they prepared to leave at dawn. "If Caldwell suspects a trap, ... I know," Catherine said, checking the small derringer Harper had provided her. "But Elizabeth is worth the risk." Miles caught her hand. "Just ... be careful. I've lost too many people already." The quiet admission touched Catherine deeply. She leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to his cheek. "You won't lose me," she promised. The ride to Silverdale took most of the day, with Harper leading them along little-used trails to avoid Caldwell's patrols. By late afternoon, they were positioned on a ridge overlooking the town, with Caldwell's mansion clearly visible on the opposite hill. "My men are in place," Harper confirmed after returning from a brief scouting mission. 3 deputies, all positioned to cover the main exits from Caldwell's property. Catherine adjusted her clothing address. Harper had procured from a sympathetic widow in a nearby homestead. "How do I look?" she asked, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Like a woman with a purpose," Miles replied softly. The plan was set in motion as dusk fell. Catherine rode openly into town, directly to Caldwell's front gate. Miles and Harper circled around to approach from the rear of the property, where the gardens offered cover. From their position, they watched as Catherine was escorted inside by 2 armed guards. Miles gripped his rifle tighter, every instinct screaming at him to follow her in. "She'll be fine," Harper reassured him, though his own expression was grim. "Catherine's a strong woman." "Strong doesn't stop bullets," Miles muttered inside the mansion. Catherine was led through opulent hallways to a study where Randall Caldwell sat behind a massive desk. He was a large man with cold eyes and an immaculately trimmed beard, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the rough clothing of his guards. "Miss Walsh," he greeted her, his voice deceptively pleasant. "I must say, your resilience is remarkable. My men were quite certain they'd left you to die." Catherine stood tall despite her fear. "Where is my sister?" Caldwell smiled thinly. "Straight to business, I see. Your sister is comfortable, for now. Her continued comfort depends entirely on you." "I want to see her," Catherine demanded. Caldwell considered this, then nodded to one of his men. "Bring the girl." Minutes later, Elizabeth was led into the room, her face lighting up at the sight of her sister. "Catherine!" The sisters embraced briefly before one of the guards pulled Elizabeth back. Catherine noted the bruise on her sister's cheek with rising anger. "Now," Caldwell said, leaning forward, "let's discuss the terms of your surrender. Where is my property?" "You mean the ledger that proves you're a murderer and a thief?" Catherine replied coolly. "I know you searched my room. Did you really think I'd hide something so valuable there?" Outside, Miles and Harper had reached the garden wall. 2 guards patrolled nearby, making regular circuits around the property. "We need to time this perfectly," Harper whispered, checking his pocket watch. "My men will create a diversion at the front gate in exactly 3 minutes." Miles nodded, his focus absolute as he tracked the guards' movements. When the sound of shouting erupted from the front of the property, the guards hesitated, then ran toward the commotion. Miles and Harper scaled the wall quickly, dropping into the garden on the other side. They moved silently toward the house, using the elaborate shrubbery for cover. Through a large window, Miles could see Catherine standing before Caldwell's desk, Elizabeth slightly behind her. Inside, the tension was mounting. "I don't have time for games, Miss Walsh," Caldwell snapped, standing abruptly. "The ledger, now, or your sister suffers the consequences." "If you harm her, you'll never find it," Catherine warned. "I've ensured that if anything happens to either of us, the ledger goes straight to the territorial governor." Caldwell studied her face, trying to determine if she was bluffing. "You're in no position to negotiate." "On the contrary," Catherine replied, "I'm the only one who knows where it is. Kill me, and it's lost to you forever." The commotion at the front gate drew Caldwell's attention. He moved to the window, peering out with growing concern. What's happening out there? Catherine seized the moment of distraction to reach for Elizabeth's hand, squeezing it reassuringly. Her sister's eyes were wide with fear but trusting. "It seems your time is running out, Mr. Caldwell," Catherine observed. "Perhaps we should expedite our negotiation. My sister and I leave here safely, and I tell you where to find the ledger." Caldwell turned back to her, fury evident in his features. "You think I don't know a trap when I see one? You've brought the law with you." Before Catherine could respond, the study door burst open. One of Caldwell's men stumbled in, blood streaming from a head wound. "U.S. Marshals," he gasped. At the front gate and coming in through the garden. Caldwell's face contorted with rage. He drew a pistol from his desk drawer, aiming it directly at Catherine. "You've made a grave miscalculation, Miss Walsh." The window behind him shattered as Miles crashed through, tackling Caldwell to the ground. The gun discharged, the bullet embedding itself in the ceiling as they struggled. Harper appeared in the doorway simultaneously, his badge displayed prominently as he aimed his weapon at the remaining guards. "U.S. Marshal," he announced. "Drop your weapons." The guards hesitated, then complied as more deputies appeared behind. Harper. Miles had subdued Caldwell, pressing the man's face into the expensive carpet as he secured his hands behind his back. "It's over," he told the mine owner. "Where's the ledger?" "Go to hell." Caldwell spat. Catherine moved to the desk, pulling open drawers until she found what she was looking for. A leather-bound book with columns of figures and names. "Here," she said, handing it to Harper. "Everything you need to convict him." As Caldwell was led away by Harper's deputies, Catherine and Elizabeth clung to each other, tears of relief flowing freely. Miles stood nearby, watching the reunion with a mixture of joy and an unexpected pang of loss. Catherine looked up, meeting his eyes over her sister's shoulder. The gratitude and something deeper in her gaze drew him forward until he stood before the sisters. "Elizabeth," Catherine said, turning to her sister, "this is Miles Blackwood. He saved my life." Elizabeth studied him with eyes remarkably like her sister's. "Thank you," she said simply, embracing him with unexpected warmth. Awkwardly returned the hug, his eyes finding Catherine's over the girl's shoulder. Something passed between them, a question, a possibility. Later, as Harper organized the transfer of Caldwell and his men to the territorial prison, Miles found Catherine alone on the mansion's veranda, watching the stars emerge in the evening. "Sky, what happens now?" he asked, joining her at the railing. Catherine turned to him, her face peaceful despite the ordeal they'd endured. "Elizabeth and I will testify at Caldwell's trial. After that... I'm not sure. We'll need to start over. Somewhere." Miles nodded, looking out at the distant mountains. "I've been thinking about that. Starting over." Catherine's hand found his on the railing. "Have you now?" "Been running a long time," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time to stop." "And where would you stop?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miles turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Wherever you and Elizabeth are, if you'll have me." Catherine's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I think we would like that very much, Mr. Blackwood." Miles leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a gentle kiss that held the promise of healing for them both. When they parted, he touched the faded star on his vest. "Think I'm ready to take this off now," he said. "Been carrying it and what it represents long enough." Catherine unpinned the star, holding it in her palm for a moment before closing, her fingers around it. "Not a reminder of failure anymore," she said, "but of finding me in that canyon when I needed you most." As they stood together under the vast western sky, Miles felt the weight of 6 years of solitude lift from his shoulders. He had ridden into Rattlesnake Canyon, a man haunted by his past, and emerged with a future he never thought possible, one with purpose, with family, with love. In saving Catherine, he had found his own salvation. If you enjoyed this tale of redemption in the Wild West, please like, subscribe, and share. Leave a comment below telling us what kind of Western story you'd like to hear next.